This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you, and I'm glad that we can have these conversations because some stuff that we'd love, of course, to get into and get a greater understanding of. And also, in the other hot seat of the Situation Room is Benedict Washira, who is the Secretary of the Kenya-Cuba Friendship Society. Good morning.
Good morning.
Karibu sana.
Asante sana.
So, as it would be the reverse in another place, here we put you to work a little bit before we get into conversation. The concept is that we go to around the African continent, and every week we come back from one country with its proverbs, and then we ask you to interpret these proverbs for us. And Dennis will do that with you.
Yeah, so the country we're in today is Angola, right? The seventh largest country in the continent, right? Mm-hmm. Twice as big as France. The country that is rich in gold, diamond, oil, petroleum products, as well as the baobab trees in Angola, just amazing. Yeah. But these are the proverbs you're getting from Angola. The one who asks many questions never buys anything. The one who asks many questions never buys anything. Ladies go first. Balozi, how would you interpret it?
Okay. Well, please don't ask me many questions.
Well done. Okay.
And you have bring a very, very nice proverb. I was in Angola for 2 years, so I have had the opportunity to exchange a lot with the Angolan people. And, as I told you before, please don't ask many questions, but, I will be very honored to answer all your questions. Angola is, for me, it was my first time abroad. It was my first missions abroad in my foreign service. So the experience it's amazing. It's amazing. But once again, don't ask me many questions, please.
Right. Let's go to Ashira.
Well, I think that as a human being, you must be decisive in whatever you do. You must ask questions, but they must not be too many, and you must make the decisions at the right time.
Yeah.
So I think that's the essence of the proverb.
Right. To make a decision and then to be able to go with it. As we enter into this conversation, we'll be talking about, of course, sovereignty. We'll talk about, state responsibility. We'll talk about relationships. But let's start off with the relationship that Cuba has with Kenya. First of all, and see how that has developed over the years. For many people, the length and breadth of that relationship is that there were some Cuban doctors who came to Kenya and shared their expertise. But then that's it. But there's a lot more in that relationship, one would imagine. Balozi, open that up for us a little bit.
Yes, well, we have a very, very close relationship with Kenya, and we enjoyed very cordial relationships since 1995. Even in October last year, we celebrated 30th anniversary of relationship between Cuba and Kenya. There are some official delegations from Cuba, and there are some Kenyan official delegations who has traveled to Cuba. And in that context, there has been opportunity to exchange a lot of issues, to establish, a kind of cooperation in different areas. So currently, there are many Kenyan students studying medicine in Cuba as part of the Cuban scholarship programs. And there has been more than 100 Kenyans who have studied in Cuba. So Cuba has contributed to the training, or to the training of human resources of Kenya. And of course, Cuba has had the support of Kenya in many international forums like the African Union and the United Nations. And I have to point it out, the support we have received from the Kenyan government every year, because Kenyan government has supported the Cuban resolution against the economic, commercial, and financial embargoes over Cuba. So that's something that we appreciate very much. Of course, there are a lot of issues we can improve, we can enhance the relationship with Kenya, because there are many areas, there are many potential between our two countries.
Sure. We talk about Friends of Cuba, like Ndu was said, the most many of us do know is the fact that we had Cuban doctors in the country who treated us, right? But here now we have an institution, Friends of Cuba, in the country. And what does that entail? What does that mean? I mean, in terms of Kenyans being friends with Cuba, how deeply ingrained is that?
Well, in international relations, there are two types of relationships between countries and peoples. So the first one is the formal relations, that is the diplomatic relations, and the one that is represented by the ambassador here and the ambassador of Kenya to Cuba and so on and so forth. Then there's the people-to-people relations. So this one is not concerned about the diplomacy and what have you, but what is the relationship between the people themselves. There are cultural exchanges, there are political exchanges, there are ideological exchanges. There are many things that the people of Cuba and the people of Kenya can relate into. So we've had some of the scholarships going through the diplomatic channels, some of them going through the Kenya-Cuba Friendship Society. We've had doctors, agricultural engineers, and sports experts being trained, in Cuba for free, full scholarship, 4 or 5 years. You pay nothing, absolutely nothing, and some of these scholarships have come through the society itself. We've had Cubans coming into Kenya wanting to experience the cultural aspects that you might not really experience if you come through the formal channels, and that's where now the people-to-people relations come in. There is the solidarity also. For example, in a country like Cuba, we have the blockade today. It has been there for over 60 years, the economic, financial blockade from the US. So we, as the people of Kenya, are saying, no, we cannot continue having this kind of blockade. So that is something that we, as a people, not as a government, are opposing. Luckily, our aspirations are also aligned to what the Kenya government is saying, because Kenya has supported the ending of the blockade at the United Nations General Assembly for all the years, and has been supported by almost all countries, except 2 or 3. That is the US, Israel, and some other small island. I can't remember the name. So it is something that we've been doing and we intend to continue doing. Yes.
So, that kind of throws us into what would be murky waters, but necessary for us to talk about, because, again, in international relations and diplomatic relations, you find that sometimes the enemy of your enemy is your friend. But in this case, the friend of your enemy is your enemy, so it would be that we cannot run away from geopolitical relationships in this day and age, and that the world basically has called for the lifting of this embargo on Cuba that has been there for decades. Give us a little bit as to the reasoning behind why this happened. It began in 1960, for crying out loud. We're in 2026. So that means that there's certain things on this globe that Cuba is precluded from operating in. Why? What did Cuba do?
Well, it's not exactly about behavior.
I get it.
We are very, very good boys and girls. But I think for more than 100 years, the ties between Cuba and the United States has been marked on one hand on the pretensions of our neighborhood to dominate Cuba, but on the other hand, by the determination of Cubans to be free, independent, and sovereign. And, it has a cost. That's what I think. We have a cost. And the strategic goal, the strategic objective of these policies has been to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. And for more than 60 years, Cuba has faced an economic, commercial, and financial blockade, including a lot of actions, a lot of methods. And for instance, we have faced sabotage to our economy. We have faced, attempts to assassinate the Cuban leaders. We have faced a lot of things, even biological wars against Cuba. And the embargo, and more recently, the decision of the U.S. government to include Cuba in the list of countries that sponsor terrorism. That the objective is the same: to overthrow the Cuban Revolution, to overthrow the Cuban constitutional order. That's the main objective. And this is an asymmetric work. With Cuba, a small island, and we are talking about the most powerful country all over the world. So, but they don't stop in this policy they continues, the policy, and even now, I think they have tried tighten these policies towards Cuba.
Okay, so Castro's mechanism at that time, it's no secret, was to nationalize previously owned U.S. businesses in Cuba. And I mean, how dare you nationalize businesses that previously were owned by the almighty U.S. And it would appear as though that was a poke in the face by Cuba under Castro to the U.S. Then you would ask the question, what happens to nationalism and what happens to state sovereignty? It's one of the things that we're talking about today. Are we seeing that on this side, when Cuba holds fast to its ideals, that they're talking about holding on to nationalism, patriotism, sovereignty, as opposed to allowing, like you said, the most powerful nation in the world, arguably, at this point? What is it that interests America, the U.S., with this small island that would keep it in its claws for 60 years?
I think there is small groups in the U.S. I'm talking about the Cuban Americans, and more recently, the current Secretary of State. I think they have something like a commitment, because it's true, they lost some properties. They lost some properties, but those properties were put on the hands of the Cuban populations. The ones, I'm talking about the majority of the Cuban populations. Even Cuba at that time, because there were not only U.S. properties, we are talking about properties from different countries. And Cuba was able to let's say, to indemnize, to pay an indemnization for those properties. So it means that this is not the reason. The reason is that they have lost properties, but they have lost at the same time, they have lost the war within small nations. So that's why they continue pushing in order to recover what they have lost. But we are determined. We are determined to keep our conquers. We are determined to keep our sovereignty. We are determined to keep our independence as a country.
And I think my next question would be, the blockade that has existed for a very long time, it is just not, because when we look at Cuba, the country, but in Cuba, there are people.
Correct.
And when we talk about these blockades and the policies that have been passed by the United States, these are policies that have disenfranchised the Cuban people in one way or the other. So the impact must have been huge, because we're talking about 50, 60 years, of being under this blockade, people not being able to see their loved ones who live in the United States of America, not being able to do business rightfully so, not being able to even tap into the technologies that do exist, simply because of a policy that was made because you were defeated on a war that you shouldn't have been in the first place. And one then asks the question, from Balosi's perspective, what has been the impact and what is the role of the citizens of the world, friends of Cuba, to work together to end that blockade? Because whether we like it or not, the world is one united people, only borders put in place by one would say the colonialists, or those who came in and drew those borders that never existed in the first place.
Correct. You see, first of all, there are estimates from the UN that say that Cuba has lost over $1.1 trillion. Trillion dollars, that's over 100 trillion Kenya shillings, right? Over the past 6, and this is the UN report.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that is not something that we can joke around. Our budget,
it's 4 trillion.
Yeah, is much less, for annual budget. So it's a big loss to the Cuban people. They cannot access medical technology, for example. They cannot access machinery for agriculture and what have you. They cannot access a lot of things, because if a country trades with Cuba and wants to also trade with the US will tell them no, because you traded with Cuba, you cannot trade with us. And of course, the US is the biggest economy, and you'd want to trade with it more than you'd want to trade with a small country like Cuba. But sovereignty means that the people must have the right to decide their own future. So in 1959, Cubans decided that their future should be in socialism, their future should be under Fidel Castro, their future should be under a completely different ideological framework than that of the United States of America. So it was their right to do that, right? And the moment we start allowing the US, and it has been doing this for the longest period, if we allow it to interfere with the decisions or the independent decisions of the peoples of different countries, then we are really questioning the role of sovereignty, the role of international law. And as such, the US must be stopped. It is a power today. They think they can do anything. We've seen what they did in Venezuela the other day. They kidnapped a president. We've seen Trump saying he will take Greenland from Denmark. So it's impunity. But history has shown us that all powers eventually fall. All powers eventually fall, but they do not fall on their own. There must be voices. Countries must speak out against these powers. Individuals must speak out against these powers. Media stations like yours must speak out against these powers. So we'll continue with our campaigns. We'll condemn. We will do it on social media. We'll hold demonstrations. We'll write letters and what have you. We'll continue with outreaches like this. But eventually, a time will come when the imperial power of the US will fall. And we hope that it will be sooner than later.
I believe that the next world conflict will not be fought with guns and bombs. That the next major conflict that we see will be an economic one, or it will be a geopolitical one, and it could be akin to the Cold War that took place in the 80s, and 70s, 60s. I mean, it would be akin to that. But sometimes when we think geopolitically, when we think around the realms of international relations, just like that question Dennis is asking, we don't make a connection to that war that's happening in boardrooms and or international assemblies and what is happening on the ground. So when we talk about people suffering, what are we talking about? When we have an embargo for 60 years, that means your goods cannot leave the country and be bought by huge populations. That means that energy is very expensive, I would imagine. But what happens to the people? And I think this is for both of you. What happens to the people? That really what's happening to the people on an island that is resource rich, right? Because I'm also of the opinion that the US wouldn't be bothered with Cuba if it didn't have any resources. Now, how does it affect people, this embargo that we see?
Yeah, well, the situation is, the embargo has an overwhelming impact. And it affects every sector of the Cuban economy, but it has an special impact on the Cuban population. Sometimes it is said, well, the policies towards Cuba, it's against the Cuban government. It's not against the Cuban people, but at the same time, it's the Cuban population, the one which is suffering the consequences of the embargo. I would say because, for instance, there is a very sensitive sector. I'm talking about health sector. Cuba used to be at the top in Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of infant mortality. Currently, because of the impact of the embargo, our rate of infant mortality has grown because we used to have a 5% of infant mortality rate, and currently in the last year, for instance, we have 8.5. The rate will grows to 8.5. So it means that we have a very, very important impact on a very, very sensitive sector, which is, we are talking about the health sector. But it's the same thing with the rest of the sectors. And for instance, we are currently, I was reading the news today, and for instance, our population is suffering a lot of powers, a cut, in the powers and the electricity. And it means that, for instance, we have at least 2-3 hours per day with electricity, with power. So the same thing with medications. We are suffering there because we cannot import raw material to produce at so our biotechnology industry, which is one of the most important source of incomes in Cuba, is being affected by this situation. The sports, education, most of the sectors have been impacted to the, and the embargo embargo, it classifies as a genocide because it affects the most of the Cuban population. It's something that is the main obstacle to the Cuban development, is economic development. So that's a policy has been told by Washiri. It has been criticized. It has been denounced every year at the United Nations and in many international forums.
But and before that, maybe I'll agree with you that the economy influences the politics, and therefore the interest of the US globally has been the resources of other countries. But with respect to Cuba, is a little bit different because it is an ideological threat. Because Cuba is telling or showing the US and the whole world that somebody can go study from nursery school to the university to the highest level without any debt, graduating with any debt at zero cost. Cuba is showing the US that people can go to hospitals, people can get medication without paying a single cent. So this is a threat to a pharmaceutical industrial complex, which is is based in the US. Cuba is showing the US that people can have free housing, right? Even when their country is very poor. Again, this is a threat to the US because housing is a big issue, for the capitalists in the US. So the biggest threat that Cuba has been showing the US is not really the economic one, but the ideological one. That things can be done in a different way, and for a country with a lot of resources like the US, then things can be done in a better way if they chose a different ideological path. So that is why the US has always been threatened by Cuba. And Cuba is very close to the US. The distance between Nairobi and Nakuru is longer, is farther than the distance between Cuba and the US. And therefore, many Americans can see what is happening in Cuba. There are Americans who could not afford medication, cancer medication and what have you in the US, and they had to travel to Cuba to access this medication, a country that is much smaller, much poorer and what have you. So there is that ideological threat other than the economic one. So, and that is what really threatens the US with respect to Cuba.
And Ambassador, as you're just having this discussion, at the center of it all, personally for me, is the people. Why do I say that? Because the statistics have just given us about mortality of children in the country continues to grow up. Then you connect the dots, because if the country does not get what it needs in its healthcare system, simply because whilst Cuba and the United States are not seeing eye to eye, but Cuba and another country are seeing eye to eye, but this country, simply because of their friendship with the US, Cuba is unable to get that, then one asks the question, even as we walk to the UN every day and condemn it, and we read down the United States of America, if there is no intentional move to see that that problem is resolved, there's nothing we're doing, because we have been condemning it for 60 years.
Yeah.
What are we doing? And one would ask the question then, are these institutions that we have around the world that are supposed to bring global order meant to do that, or is the big brother bigger than these institutions that are there to maintain order?
It's a very interesting question. It's true. Nothing happened, because normally people say, well, every year Cuba presents its resolution at the United Nations. But I think it has an impact. It has an impact. It's a moral one, because it's the world recognizing that this policy is not a good one, that this policy has not reaching the results it has as a main objective, but it's very sad. At the same time, it's very sad, because the embargo has the commercial financial embargo, or blockade, because we call it blockade, has an extraterritorial impact. And so there are many companies, pharmaceutical companies, companies in charge of, supplying foods and raw materials to Cuba, that they are afraid because of the policies towards them. So for instance, a company or a bank, at least a bank, or they could be punished because, doing business with Cuba. At the same time, you have to take into account that Cuba has been included. There is a list at the Department of State, which is the list of countries sponsoring terrorism. So it's an unfair, it's an arbitrary inclusion, but at the same time, it creates a lot of problem because when Cuba asks for a credit, it's being considered as country sponsored terrorism, so those banks cannot give us the credit, cannot give us, the resources we need to develop our country. So it means that it's like a let's close the circle, let's try to create the conditions to overthrow the Cuban Revolution, to overthrow the Cuban example in the war. So that's something that it's a matter of concern. But at the same time, in the current, this year, at the very beginning of the year, it seems that the policies towards Cuba has been, tightened. There have been some cycle, because you could tell me during Obama's administration there were some opening, but afterwards, there was Biden administration, there was Trump administration, and 243 measures against Cuba were adopted. So it means that the idea is to asphyxiate the Cuban, because Cuba is like an example why Cuba is still alive in spite of 60 years of pressures. So that's the main concern of the U.S.
Well, sure, does it serve as an example? This is interesting because I can make a connection there between what's happening there and what could possibly happen with other countries around the world. We know that 2025 was the year where a lot of countries on the continent, for example, were thrown into shock because 25 plus years of development aid and funding then looked like it was going to go out the window, right?
Yes.
And of course, with the Trump administration, that meant that it started to ask questions about, okay, who's this money going to and what is happening there? And so aid now that was coming in started to reduce. And significantly, in some cases, those taps were closed completely. We've seen this year, with a furtherance of now quite a number of African countries being closed off from then being able to get immigration documentation, visas and such. The US has said, well, for now, thanks very much, but we're not receiving applications from your country. Thank you. Hold on to that. He's done that, right? And this is a single-handed executive order from the Office of the President of the United States. Could be personality administration. Who knows? But is it giving rise to the very lesson, perhaps, that Cuba has shown, that, using your words, that for 60 years you basically shut the taps, but I'm still breathing? So there's a possibility that you can actually be responsible for your own development. You can be responsible on this global stage, actually make it work. Kicking, screaming, crawling, however, you can somehow make it work?
No, absolutely. And sanctions have never worked anywhere in the world. Whether it is in Cuba, whether it is North Korea, whether it is Iran, whether it is Venezuela, Zimbabwe, history has shown us that sanctions will never work. And before I come to that question, maybe there's a question that you asked the ambassador, but she's a diplomat. So the UN is toothless. It's toothless when it comes to the world powers, and in particular the US. It is clearly toothless. So the US is above the UN. That is what we are being told. And that's what the US... And that's why we are saying that there must be reforms within the UN system. There must be methods of accountability to all UN members. So it is true that the US is a world bully, and it does not respect international law. And it does not respect UN at all. But we still say that there's that moral responsibility for us to continue fighting for sovereignty and international law within the framework that are already there. That said, it is important indeed that countries develop their own independent economic development and growth outside dependency on aid like that from the US aid, on grants and such kind of things. Because we've seen that from what Trump is doing, it is clear that we are under their control, and they are using aid, they are using grants, they are using these bilateral and multilateral relationships to continue dominating us, to continue exploiting us. So we as countries must rise up against this. And we can only rise up by ensuring that, one, we develop our own economies independently of other nations, and two, we have a proper solidarity, real, honest solidarity between genuine nations, not with countries like the US and what have you. For example, Cuba has a lot to offer in terms of biomedical technology. The first time I heard of dengue fever was about 12, 15 years ago. I had never heard about it, but there were Cuban researchers who are working with our own researchers here at Cambridge so that they could study this virus and come up with ways of resolving it. That is a solidarity kind of relationship that does not impose conditions and what have you over the others. So it is indeed true that countries must cut themselves off the shackles of imperialism and domination, particularly by the US, the West, and other world powers.
Ambassador, the world today finds itself in a very interesting place, So for 60 years, Cuba has stood its ground and said, no, you will not control us. We will run our businesses. That despite the sanctions, despite the blockade that has been there, we will continue to move forward and continue to provide for our people whichever way we will, right? And this is pretty much the same story just next door in Venezuela. But we see what that has happened. The President of the Republic was picked up, simply because he said, this is our oil and we will do business with it whichever way we want. You will not control us. But today we see a different country has gotten in and they're saying we will even control how that oil is being sold to the world. But then ask the question, seeing that happened and the position that Cuba has held for 60 years, what does that communicate? What does that say? What signals is it sending to the Cuban population and leadership today?
So it's interesting. It's interesting as well, But it's interesting to know that 32 people died in Venezuela. And it sent a message. It sent a message of determination of the Cuban people to continue for 60 years more. And we are taking some measures from the internal and from the external point of view. But we are ready because, we have a history. We have a commitment with our heroes. We have a commitment with the new generations. And we will continue fighting. We will continue because, we know that we have the reason. We know that the future is ours. That in spite of there are some voices that are not so high, Cuba will continue expressing, their commitment with our heroes and with our future generations. That's something very important. It's sad what happened in Venezuela, and what Cuba's position is, and we have condemned in a strong ways the situation, and we are following the news. Of course, we are not here to tell you what the situation is, because taking into account what Shiri has already said, I'm a diplomat, so we have to take care with our opinions, with our criteria. But we know what the position of Cuba has been. But what I can assure you is that we are determined to defend our principles. We are determined to defend our values. Perhaps a lot of people will die defending those principles, those values. But that's the way we are. That's the way we have learned from our heroes, and we have a commitment with the war. We have a commitment because the entire world is looking about Cuba. The entire world is looking about what Cuba is doing, what Cuba is resisting.
Okay. So, I'm going to go back to that example because I do think that there are not a lot of countries, especially in what, the world has termed as the developing world, who are trying to reimagine a world without a big brother status, as it were. So what would you do if that funding dried up completely? And that so long as, when there is a particular person in leadership in a particular country, it's going to affect you in one way or another. So what is it? And again, coming to both of you, what is Cuba doing to stay afloat? What policies have you put in place to ensure that, okay, fine, U.S. business is not coming your way, but what do you do to ensure that you can even send medical personnel to other countries to give their expertise, that you can build your country one block at a time? What do you do? How do you do it?
Yeah, so I think currently we are working in the implementation of a new macroeconomic stabilization program. So it's a comprehensive program. It's a very, very comprehensive program, and we are trying. At least we are making our best effort to improve the Cuban economy in spite of the challenges we are facing, and at the same time we are creating a more dynamic business environment. So and the idea is to revitalize the Cuban economy. I think it was issued a new portfolio of investments. I was looking the figures, and the new portfolio of investments comprised 426 projects exceeding 30 billion of dollars in 30 sectors. And at the same time, of course, we are strengthening ties with many countries all over the world, or some countries all over the world, and it's like a mixing of internal measures, but at the same time, measures from with our partners, and to improve the investments in Cuba and things like that.
So you have a president in Bermudez who is the first president outside of the Castro family since 1959 to then rule. But it would appear as though he's still in the same position as it has been, whereby Cuba must stand on its own. Is that the same across governance? You alluded to that, to say that we must remain in this position, that we are not going to... we're not going to sit on the fence about this. The president still towing the same line today. New president as of January. Is he still towing the same line?
You mean towards Cuba?
Yes.
He says this.
The new president, is he still towing the same line? Is it still the same message that is being put out to the people of Cuba and to the world, that no matter what, we will retain in terms of sovereignty and nationalism, and retain this position that has been there since the embargoes came into place?
You mean the Cuban president?
Yes.
It's the same policy.
Yeah,
it's the same policy. It's a continuity of the position of Cuba, a historical position.
Yeah,
a historical position.
Do you think there are lessons, Washira, here that others can pick up on and say, you know what, they've been locked out of the world literally for 60 years, but you know what, they're making it happen? And that could be because people say, look, when the freeze on aid came, many countries already had said, we're done, we are finished, what's going to happen?
It's true. It means that countries must look for alternatives, and they must reprioritize, their economy. For example, when the U.S. aid funding was cut, there was a real risk that ARVs and HIV medication will not be available for our people. So it means that our priority as a country has been upside down, in that health should be a critical sector that must be supported by the state. It must not be dependent. The lives of the people cannot be dependent on aid. So we must reprioritize our economy. Secondly, we must look for alternatives that are within our borders and within countries that are friendly to us. For example, when it comes to energy, I know that Cuba as a country has gone deep into green energy, into alternative forms of energy. Kenya, for example, has a potential in terms of geothermal energy of 6,000 to 9,000 known potential. There's no reason why we are not exploiting this potential to the maximum, yet we know that if we had sanctions today and we were told that we are no longer going to import oil and energy, we will be in problems. So it is important that countries start reorganizing the economy so that they get as much as possible from within their borders in anticipation for policies that are coming from presidents like Trump and others. And the beauty about Trump in his badness is that he is honest. He is open.
Yeah, he's not pretending.
He's not pretending, you know.
Like it is,
So
yeah.
unlike Obamas and Clintons and others who will pretend, that we are good, he tells you, I'm going to hit you, and he's hitting you. So he's told Africans that he doesn't value them. In his first term, he called us shit something. He's told South Africans that he will punish them for allegedly killing whites, for allegedly passing a law that says the land that your forefathers took by force from our people will be nationalized and used for the benefit of everyone. He's threatening the South Africa, and from what happened in Venezuela, these threats cannot be taken lightly. Just last year, December, he bombed Nigeria.
He did.
Of course, later, as a Christmas gift, bombing Muslims as a Christmas gift. But later he came, or rather the Algerian government came and said that they did it together and they knew.
It was a joint operation.
Joint operation, later.
Yeah.
But the immediate reaction was also of shock. They didn't know that, Trump had planned this operation, and he has said as such. So world peace, world harmony is at risk. So countries must reorganize their economies and also probably reorganize their defenses. There are 3 countries in the world, people don't know, that have defeated the US in war, real war. And the first one was North Korea. The second one was Vietnam, at huge human cost.
Yeah.
And the third one was Cuba. In 1961, when the Americans trained some soldiers and deployed them, thousands of soldiers deployed them
The
into
missile
Cuba.
crisis, yeah.
And they were defeated. The Bay of Pig war. They were defeated. They were humiliated. So we must organize our defenses and know that there is a threat to peace as long as the US is there, as long as imperialism continues running the world.
I look at it differently, right? Like we've said, the next world war isn't about bombs, isn't about physical war. It's about geopolitics. And we talk about geopolitics. We have the big brother who wants to control everybody else. But what if everybody else stood together against the big brother? Why do I say that? Because even as we speak about the sanctions that have been given to different countries or the tariffs in different countries, what's the bottom line? It's business, right?
Correct.
If you want to do business with us, you must come and invest here. So they're still looking at what they need from each and every single other country there is.
Correct.
But because everyone else is speaking one language, that you cannot boss us, that we also have a say, we are the citizens of the world and we are independent citizens of sound mind who can make our own decisions. What would it look like if the world spoke in unison and said, we will not bow down to an oppressor, that we will work with those we want to work with, despite of who you think you are? Because if you want to sell your tractors as United States of America to Kenya, we could decide to buy those tractors from another vendor and leave you with your tractors. What would that look like? And perhaps, Balozi, should that be the focus the world is looking at?
I think you are talking about unity, you are talking about integration, and those are values that we have to recover, and there is something that we are losing as well, is the value of multilateralism. That's something very important, because we have said something regarding geopolitical issues. We are saying something regarding challenges. You are talking about conflicts. You are talking about, wars. You are talking about a lot of bad things, to say at least a phrase. So, unity, international cooperation, solidarity are words that we have to look for. And I would like to talk about Cuba, because I'm the Cuban ambassador, and we have been always ready to give. We are being always ready to express, and with with real facts, to express that a better world is possible, that if we are united, we are stronger. And for instance, I'm just remembering when I was ambassador to the Gambia. It's a very, very small country in Africa. And it was amazing because there was a Cuban medical team working there. It was around 100 Cuban doctors and nurses. And and this small country, the public health system was covered just by Cuban doctors. And so it means that if we unite, and Cuba is not a rich country, so if we are united, if we help each other with one and each other, I think that the world could be much better, and we will get more respect from the big brother. That's something that I'm thinking of. But integration is a must. Unity is a must. Solidarity is a must in the current times, and we cannot avoid the value of multilateralism, because a country by itself cannot move the world.
Steve Alozimini would say, being rich is not in how much you have in the bank, really.
Yeah, that's true.
Being rich is in moving to countries and helping with the healthcare system, even when you yourself is struggling with your own healthcare system. Richness is not in how many bombs you have.
That's true.
But as we talk about unity, what would unity of countries coming together and speaking that language and walking the talk, not just talking?
No, first of all, there must be the ideological unity of these countries that are coming in. They must agree that you're calling it bullying, I'm calling it imperialism, is an enemy to world peace, So once they agree on that basis, then it's easier to work together. Because I agree with you that there's economic foundation to all these developments that we are seeing. But what supports or what strengthens this kind of moves is the military. So, for example, the US has always wanted the Venezuelan oil, which has the world's highest known reserves. They've tried sanctions, they've tried everything, and it has failed. So what do they do next? They send in Delta Force, they send in their military. So if the imperialist competition for resources, world resources, continues unabated, then there's real risk that we might go into a world war, And perhaps we wouldn't want to go there, but perhaps that is the point when the end of the US will come in and will usher in a new world order. But to prevent that, countries must be brave to speak against those in power, to speak against power itself. When the Venezuelan president was abducted, kidnapped, most of these countries were quiet. African countries, European countries, many of them went quiet. Why? Because they were intimidated. Maybe they thought they'd be next if they spoke. But if they spoke, and they spoke in one voice, then it will deter such kind of international law violations in the future. So it must start with speaking out. It must continue with economic solidarity, and people must be politically aligned against imperialism, against U.S. bully, against Western imperialism, against interference that is not aligned with the aspirations of the people of the particular country.
Yeah. You alluded towards unity, and I think that's come, that I think about past leaders who were probably put in the same box as regional strongmen and agents of terrorism. And one of the men that comes to mind is Muammar Gaddafi. What he wanted for African nations is along the lines of what we speak about today, that in your current situation, what is the best you can do with what you have? And we do have regional bodies. I mean, for crying out loud, the African Union is funded by external, funding. The Organization for African Unity, with its original tenets, meant certain things, but that's kind of fallen along the wayside. The United Nations that you speak of, interestingly enough, formed after the League of Nations, formed in that time after the Second World War. But the people who sat to make the decisions are still the people that we're talking about today, if we want to be honest. Is there, and I know that there's probably a lot of aversion towards any kind of unification of countries who may have been previously stepped on or looked down upon. But is that the way to go into the future?
Absolutely, particularly for Africa. We can only develop if we unite, Pan-Africanism is a spirit that has been there. They have tried to kill it. It started with the likes of Kwame Nkrumah. It was promoted by the likes of Lumumba. We had Muammar Gaddafi coming in and saying that Africa must unite. We must have one currency. We must share. In and saying that Africa must unite. We must have one currency. We must share our resources. We must... and even the AU itself, or OAU, most of the funding was coming from Libya, and after the fall of Libya, we are having all these problems. So for Africa to prosper, Africa must unite, because these borders are artificial. There's no reason why Kenya cannot access the Somali sea line and the maritime benefits that are there. There's no reason why somebody from Ethiopia cannot access energy from other countries, and they have to do all this damming and what have you. There's no reason why a country might go in hunger when countries like DRC, Zambia, Zimbabwe can feed the whole of Africa quite comfortably.
Right.
So the question of unity of African people and African states is quite critical. And if you start with Africa, go to maybe South-South relations and so on and so forth. But that is unity that must be done under Pan-Africanism and under the thought of the likes of Kwame Nkrumah and Muammar Gaddafi.
You sit in a diplomatic space, Balozi, obviously, and the art of diplomacy, essentially, as we've been told by, is something that's practiced, but that doesn't take away from the passion, obviously, for nationhood. Do we see a situation going into the future where some of these things will start to turn on their head? Will they change with the things that we've spoken about?
I cannot lose. We cannot lose the hope. So if you lose the hope, so we are in the hands of the enemy. So we have to keep working, and diplomacy, it's a science. It's a science of building bridges. So I think there are many areas to cooperate, and even areas like culture, because culture has a lot of things to do. When you look at Cuba, it's a very distant country, and Africa, and there are a lot of points of commons. Because many centuries ago, a lot of Africans were taken as slaves to Cuba. And so we are talking about 400,000 Africans who were taken to Cuba. Normally we say, and I'm very proud of it, because normally say this, there is African blood in our veins. So it means culture is a very, very important issue. When you're talking about sports, there are a lot of issues. There are a lot of issues that we need to rescue in order to improve and to create a better environment in the world. It's a must. It's a necessity for the future generation.
Absolutely.
Because if we don't do it, of course, we will be in the third world war, taking into account what is happening. The lot of